Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to look at the use of software autoforms by adding hyperlinks to the controls available. In the last video in the autoforms project, we have two applications. The first application, Form Runner, allows the user to select a form. These forms are configured in external configuration files. If we select the test demo number 3 and click Run Form, this displays a form to the user. The majority of the objects in this form are configured within the configuration file, allowing you the flexibility to define controls to be placed anywhere on the screen without having to change the application. The autoforms application is driven entirely by the contents of the config folder. Within the config folder, we have a list of CSV files. If we open up the test demo 3, we can see there's a list of objects defined on it. Buttons, labels, text boxes, drop-down lists, and so on. Each of these objects has a certain number of properties. For example, the X and Y coordinates where you wish them placed on the form. Each object also has an identifier, a unique identifier for the object itself used within the code. We have covered a range of controls to display on your form within these configuration files. Today we're going to add a new object, in this case a hyperlink or URL. There may be times in the design of your form you wish to put a hyperlink in to give the user the option of clicking on it and going to a website where more information can be gleaned for the type of the form and what they need to do to fill it in, giving the user the appropriate guidance. So that's the control we're going to add to our configuration file today. So let's go and have a look at the configuration file. If we open this up in Notepad, we'll see there are a number of rows, each row defining a different object on the screen. Since we're wanting to put a URL on the screen, we'll probably want to add 2 additional lines to this configuration file. One to put a label on the screen, and one for the URL itself. We have a number of label controls already in this file, so the data line for this is going to be remarkably similar. The first element is label, to indicate that it's a label control. We're putting in a piece of text, in this case click URL below for further information on this form. The next 2 fields are the X and Y coordinates you wish this control to appear at, in this case X coordinate 20 and Y coordinate 180. The 2 fields following this are the width and the height of the control, so we're marking this one as 200 wide and 10 high. The next and final defined column for this object is the control ID, and we're making that 2014. So now we have to define a line which is for our new type of object. So I'm going to call this URL. The next thing will be the URL itself. So for this one, we'll put in the URL of the GSF software website. And the only other things we'll actually need for this particular control are its X and Y coordinates, its width and height, and the unique identifier for the object. So having put these in, let's save the file and have a look at it. And there is our new object in the bottom row. We're defining the object as a URL, we've given it a URL in the text column, and we're putting in the coordinates for the location and the width and height. That should be all we actually need for this particular URL. So let's now have a look at the code. The first thing we're going to do is to add a new library. This URL is going to be a rich edit control. So we're going to add one of the libraries that ships with PowerBasic, the rich edit include file. And there is our library now added to the source code, richedit.include. To make this code work, we're going to need a handle for the library. The library will be loaded dynamically. So we'll declare a global further down in the code. And we'll call this library G for global, H for handle, and lib for library, defined as a D word. The autoforms application looks for a value on the command line. This defines the config file it's going to be using to display the form. So we've entered into the command line in our IDE the path to test demo 3. So if we try running the application now, we'll see it handles the label quite happily and displays that on the screen. But there's no code within the application to handle this new object, the URL. That's what we're going to do next. The handling of display of objects on the screen is done in a function called populateForm. So let's have a look at populateForm. PopulateForm is reading information from the global array for the configs. As you can see from the code, it's stepping through each record in this config array, looking for the reference object. We have title, we have button, we have label, and so on. So we're going to add a URL to the bottom of this list. So within this section of the select statement, we're going to be handling the URL control. In order to use the rich text control, we need to load a library, one of the Windows libraries. So we're doing a test on the value of our hlib global variable. If that value is 0, then the library is not yet loaded. So we're going to call one of the Windows API routines load library, defining the name of the library, riched20.dll. And we're following that with a call to initialize the common controls. So now that we've loaded our library, we'll have to set the styles of this control. These are fairly standard settings, which we can amend later on should we need to. Next, as we've done with the other controls, is we need to use the control add command to add the object to our dialog. This is going to follow the same standard as we did for all the other controls. We have the global handle for the dialog, and we have the long control variable which holds the unique identifier of this object. And then we're specifying the x and y coordinates, the width and the height, all coming from our configuration file, followed up by the style and extended style variables. There's a little more we have to do for this particular control. First of all, we'll set the background color. We can do this with the control send command, sending the value em set background color, and then specifying using the RGB function the color we wish to set. Next, we want to auto-detect the fact that this is a URL. Again, another control send command. This tells Windows that the string held within this particular control is going to be a URL, and it needs to automatically detect which parts of the string are the URL. And next, we have to prepare the system to accept events. This is where the user will click on the URL, will want something to happen. So another control send command, this time to set the event mask, with the parameter to say that it's going to be a link. Finally, we need to set the text. This will be our URL itself. We can do that quite easily with a control set text command. So this should get our URL displayed on the screen. So let's try running the application now to make sure that that's worked. And there we have on screen our label to say click URL below and the URL itself. As you can see, when the mouse hovers over the URL, the cursor changes to a hand pointing at it. However, if we click on it, at the moment nothing happens, because there is no event sitting to handle the click. That's what we're going to do next, is to create an event for this to link into our browser. So if we have a look in the event handler for the dialog itself, we'll see where the form is populated. We can see where the details are actually passed into all the controls, and further down the code, in the WM command section, there's a run control process function. This function handles all the events when objects are clicked upon. However, this won't be enough to handle the URL rich edit control. For this, we'll need to do a little bit more work. But before we do that, it's good to remember that we've actually loaded a library here. And when the form is unloaded, we'll want to unload that library as well. So let's go into our function that handles the run control process and add something to the exit of the form. So in the run control process, this handles all the events for objects being clicked upon. There is one for the save button, and there is one for the exit button. So it's within the exit button we'll want to put this extra piece of code to unload the library we have loaded. So we can do a test on the value of the global hlib variable. If that value is non-zero, then the library has been loaded and we will need to unload it. We can unload such libraries by using another Windows API call called freelibrary, followed by the handle of the library itself. This will instruct Windows that we're no longer using the library. And once Windows realizes that nothing else is using the library, it will unload it from memory. So having done that, we need to have another look now at the event handler for the dialog itself. So we're going to look at the function showDialog mainProc. In here, there is an event for command processes, and this is where we run the control process function. We're going to add a new event called wmNotify. This will be triggered when the user clicks on the URL. And we're going to create a new function to handle such processes, called runNotifyProcesses. This will allow us to have more than one URL on the screen. We're going to pass this 3 parameters: the dialog handle, the dialog control, and the L parameter value. So let's go and create this new function. So here is the skeleton of our new runNotifyProcesses function. This is going to be very similar in some ways to the run control process. So I've set up the same local variables with the addition of 2 other variables, a string variable for the URL and an nm header pointer for the construct which we're going to be using to pull back information on what's been clicked on. So our first task within this function is to do a for next loop, to step through each of the objects within the config file to see if we've got the right one. This is almost identical to what we did with the run control process. For each entry within that configuration file is pulling out the value in the ID column. This is the unique identifier of our object. It's then comparing that against the control variable being passed in. If these match, then we have indeed found the object. We can then determine the type to make sure it's the type we're looking for. And we're now going to create a select case statement to look just for URLs. And within this case statement, we're pulling back a pointer to the structure we want to look at. This will allow us to handle more than one URL on a form. We can then test to ensure that the value we've found is the one we're looking for, the actual control. And then we'll do another select case statement to work out the code. Is this a link? And if it is a link, we need to call a new function, the rich edit hyperlink handle URL function. This function is already in one of the libraries loaded at the beginning of our application. This function will perform the hyperlinking for us. So let's try running the application now to see if our hyperlink is now functional. So we can see the hyperlink on the screen. If we move the mouse over it and click with the mouse, it will launch our URL straight into the browser. So what we have successfully achieved today is we have added a new type of control to our Auto Forms application. We can now place URLs on the screen. The URL is displayed in the form underlined to indicate that it is in fact a hyperlink. And when the user clicks on this hyperlink, it will launch your default browser and display the web page. This allows you as a developer to keep documentation away from your application and accessible from a URL on a website. Hopefully you'll find this code useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.